The sun hung low over the sweeping Arizona plains, painting the dust in shades of molten gold as the rancher, Elias Ward, guided his horse along the narrow ridge leading into Apache territory, a place he'd traveled through many times, yet still respected with quiet caution. For this land belonged not to him, but to those whose ancestors had walked it long before cattle fences and weathered barns stood against the desert storms. Elias was searching for a missing calf that had strayed into the canyons when he heard a sharp cry echo against the rocks, a sound so sudden and human that it prickled the back of his neck and made him pull his reins tight. He listened again, and there it was, a strained, pained voice carried by the wind. Without hesitation he dismounted and followed the echoes between the red stone walls until he found her, Neoli, a young Apache woman he had crossed paths with before, known for her fierce independence and the quiet strength in her eyes. Yet now she lay on the ground, gripping her leg with trembling fingers, her breath unsteady and her expression tightened by a kind of pain that made Elias's stomach twist. He knelt beside her, keeping his voice calm as he asked what happened, and she forced out the words between clenched teeth. A rattlesnake, hidden beneath a clump of sagebrush, had struck before she could react, its fangs catching her just above the ankle. Elias felt the heat of the desert fade into the cold realization of danger. For out here, the nearest settlement was hours away, and Venom moved fast. Neoli tried to sit up, insisting she could walk. But the moment she put weight on her leg, her body buckled, and he caught her just in time. Elias worked quickly, tearing fabric to bind above the wound, trying to slow the spread without causing harm. But he could already see the skin around the bite swelling, darkening slightly, and even though she stayed strong, he saw the flicker of fear in her gaze. She told him she had been gathering roots and herbs for her tribe when the rattler struck, and she had been trying to make her way back alone until the pain forced her to the ground. Elias told her she wasn't alone now, not while he still had breath in his lungs, and lifted her carefully into his arms despite her protests that she didn't want to be a burden. But to Elias, helping her wasn't a burden, it was instinct, a responsibility, something he'd do for anyone, especially someone who met every hardship with the quiet resilience Neoli carried. As he moved through the canyon, carrying her toward his horse, he kept talking gently to keep her awake, asking about her tribe, her family, anything to keep her focused, while her breaths grew shallower, and she tried to fight the dizziness creeping over her like a shadow. When they reached his horse, Elias mounted with her in front of him, holding her steady as he urged the animal into a swift but careful run toward the ranch. Every minute felt like a race against a threat he couldn't see, a venom he could only hope to outrun. The rhythm of the horse's hooves thundered across the desert as Neoli leaned back against him, her strength fading, yet her determination holding firm in the way she whispered, "Don't stop. Keep going." Elias promised he wouldn't stop, not until he got her to safety, not until he found someone who could help, not until he knew she would live. The desert stretched wide before them, fierce and beautiful, but never had it felt so unforgiving as it did in that moment, when a life hung in the balance, and the only thing Elias could do was hold on tight and ride faster, praying silently that destiny would give him enough time to save her. Elias pushed his horse harder than he ever had, feeling every jolt of its strides as Neoli weakened in his arms, her breaths turning shallow and uneven, yet she fought to stay conscious, gripping his shirt tightly, as though the fabric itself grounded her to the fading world around her. The sun was sinking fast, stretching long shadows over the desert floor, and Elias knew that traveling in the dark across uneven ground with a fading rider was dangerous. But stopping was not an option. Each time he felt her head dip forward, he called her name sharply, reminding her to stay awake, telling her they were close, even when the ranch still sat miles ahead. When they finally reached the fence line, the familiar sight ignited a flicker of relief in Elias's chest. But he didn't slow down until they reached the barn where lantern light glowed warm against the dusk. His ranch hand, Mateo, rushed out, startled by the sight of Elias carrying someone so weak and pale. Without needing to ask, Mateo ran to gather water, clean cloth, and the emergency poultices they kept for snake bites. Elias laid Neoli gently on a cot inside the barn's side room, speaking to her softly, while Mateo cleaned the wound, carefully, and applied the herbal mixture taught to them years ago by an Apache healer who once traded remedies with Elias's father. Neoli winced but stayed steady, watching Elias with trust in her eyes despite the pain gripping her body. Hours passed in tense silence, broken only by the crackling lantern and the distant calls of night birds, while Elias stayed by her side, refusing to leave even when Mateo insisted he rest. The swelling around her legs slowed, then gradually eased, and the sharp fever that had risen during the ride began to cool as her body fought against the venom. Only when her breathing finally steadied and her eyes began to open with clearer focus did Elias let himself exhale fully, a wave of relief washing over him so sudden it made his hands shake. Neoli whispered her thanks, her voice hoarse but sincere, telling him she did not expect him to risk so much for her. But Elias shook his head, saying that no one deserved to face danger alone, especially not someone as strong-hearted as she was. As the night deepened and the desert winds softened, Neoli rested safely at the ranch, and Elias realized that this moment, their shared struggle, the fear, the relentless determination had tied their fates together in a way he hadn't anticipated. The venom had struck, but it had also revealed something neither of them could ignore, that life in the wildlands was never survived alone, and sometimes the strongest bonds were forged in the moments when everything seemed about to break. Dawn broke over the ranch with a quiet brilliance, washing the desert in soft gold and pink, and for the first time since the rattlesnake bite, Neoli could sit up without wincing, her legs still tender, but the worst of the venom's effects fading like a dark shadow. Retreating from the sun, Elias stood nearby, keeping a careful watch, noting every small movement and wince, aware that survival was not just about reaching help, but about the slow recovery afterward, the kind that tested patience and resilience alike. Neoli looked at him, a mixture of gratitude and quiet amusement in her eyes, teasing that she would never again venture into the canyons without a watchful partner, and Elias allowed himself a small, rare smile, knowing that even in the harsh desert, moments like this reminded him why he endured the isolation, the hard labor, and the constant threats of the wild. They spent the morning tending to the ranch, fixing fences and checking on the cattle, the conversation lighter now, filled with shared laughter and stories, the tension of the night before giving way to cautious relief. And as the sun climbed higher, casting long, steady shadows across the land, both knew that life on the frontier would always carry danger, that the Venom Strike was a reminder of nature's unpredictable cruelty, but also of courage, trust, and the bonds formed when one risked everything to save another. In the quiet peace that followed, the desert felt less empty, and both felt a renewed respect for the fragile, fleeting miracle of survival.